Здравейте, слушатели на Рацио подкаст. Аз съм Васко, вие сте с Интералия, предаването ни за култура, изкуство и общество. Този епизод на подкаста ни е малко по-специален, защото правим нещо, което досега не сме. А именно имаме епизод с англоговорящ гост. С голямо удоволствие казвам, че посетилия тук-що България професор Дейл Таунсенд, специалист по готическа литература, един от големите експерти на Обединеното кралство, се съгласи да гостува на Интералия и с него записахме един прекрасен едночасов разговор, в който си говорим за Лорд Байрън, за тъмнина, за средновековие, за руини, за разрушения, братства и замъци, за готическата субкултура, за това как литературният жанр на готиката се е родил и развил и как съществува до ден днешен. Професор Дейл Таунсенд е изключителен събеседник, сами ще видите с каква страст говори за това, което обича, това, което прави, да изследва готическото, но едно предупреждение в началото, от тук нататък след това интро, епизодът продължава на английски. А ако ви харесва това, което правим, искате да ни ударите едно рамо, да ни се вдига репутацията и още такива гости да ни търсят, можете да видите на www.racio.bg/support какви са начините, по които да ни подкрепите. А сега към професор Таунсенд. So here we are with Professor Deйл Таунсенд. Hello, Dale.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you so much.
Thanks for coming. Let me just introduce you in one sentence for all the English-speaking population that's going to listen to this podcast. So, Deйл is a professor of Gothic literature in the Manchester Center for Gothic Studies, right?
That's
and
right.
This is at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK.
That's right.
So, you've been doing your research into Gothics for quite some time now.
I have.
And I haven't. So I'll start right off the bat by asking you, can you somehow define the Gothic? We here in Ratio Podcast, it's a network of podcasts, like to start always the conversation with a definition of what we're going to talk about. So I'm wondering, how do we define, how do we understand what the Gothic is?
Well, that's a very, very interesting and important question. And I think the first thing to acknowledge is that we're working with a word that has so many different varied meanings. So I think a way into understanding what Gothic is involves talking about the word Gothic itself. Now, if you were to look up that word in, say, the Oxford English Dictionary, you will find numerous implications or meanings. You will find a reference to the ancient Goths that sacked Rome. You will find references to people wearing black hanging around city centres with wild hair, listening to bands like The Cure or Susie and the Banshees. You will find that referenced, the subcultural. You will find references to that which is medieval. One of the meanings of the term Gothic is medieval. You will also find references to that which is barbaric, uncivilized, and related to that anti-Roman or anti-classical.
Right.
You will also find references to Gothic as a particular strain in modern and contemporary literature that starts in the 18th century, associated with horror and terror and the supernatural and wonder. Now, faced with these numerous meanings, plus others, like Gothic meaning a particular kind of type, the black letter, Gothic type.
Yeah.
It is quite overwhelming to try and define what Gothic is. But I think the point to be made is that Gothic is all of these things simultaneously. It is a term that expresses a particular way of looking at the past. It's a term that expresses a fascination with the medieval. It is a term that expresses a kind of cultural subcultural impulse that is opposed to the mainstream, just like those people that we call Goths, sitting around with their clothes and their dark clothes and their white faces. It's a mode of thinking about culture that is anti-classical, anti-Roman. It is a term used in architectural circles. It is also a term used in Britain in the 17th and 18th centuries that means not only wild and uncivilized and barbaric, but also, strangely, the very, very opposite. That which is natively English and sort of germane to a sense of Englishness. Now, all of these meanings accrete and collect and sort of swarm around the term Gothic. So I think when we talk about what Gothic is, we have to almost kind of separate out. What do we mean? Are we talking about Gothic in a subcultural sense? Are we talking about Gothic in a literary sense? Are we talking about Gothic in an architectural sense? Are we talking about Gothic as a kind of racial term, thinking of the ancient Goths? So I think that's the first thing to bear in mind. Most people, when I mention the term Gothic today, think of the architectural elements. So we're thinking of pointed arches, we're thinking of flying buttresses, we're thinking of some of the great cathedrals of, say, France and Britain, the Gothic architectural style. Gothic meaning medieval in that sense. Also non-classical. It derives from a non-classical tradition. But the other most prominent set of meanings associated with the term, I think, are the literary connotations of the term. And when I mean Gothic literature, and when I talk about myself as a scholar of Gothic literature, I mean Gothic as a kind of adjective to describe a form of literature that is associated with ghosts, with the supernatural, with horror, with terror, with enchantment, with all of those dark aspects of culture that seem to come to the fore in around the time of the Enlightenment in the 18th century. So that's a very, very baggy answer to your question, Vasil, but I think it gives a sense of just the kind of cultural terrain in which we're working. An overdetermined word with so many different meanings, all of which kind of cohere and coexist at the same time. Almost impossible to separate out one precise meaning.
Yeah. Really, thank you for this extensive answer to my question. It is important because, for example, here in Bulgaria, what we usually get by Gothic is indeed first the architectural style, because this is part of our studies of art and culture at school. And we also had not an extensive, but a slight, let's say, encounter with the Gothic subculture. It's still something that we encounter nowadays, though fewer and fewer people are into this because the modern aesthetics have changed quite a lot.
Precisely.
And we are like losing these classical subcultures that we had. I call classical the ones from my childhood, from the 90s and the beginning of this century.
Indeed, yes.
All right, you're talking with such passion about the Gothic, and I was laughing like inside because last episode I recorded here was about solar punk. I don't know if you know about this aesthetic, but it's very bright and it's very contrasting with what you described with terror and wonder and ghosts and so on.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, you're a researcher in this field. I myself am doing a PhD now, and I know how hard it is to choose a topic, to choose a field to dedicate yourself to. And I cannot like skip the question of what drew you to this aesthetic, to this rather bleak-sounding literary genre.
That's a wonderful, wonderful question, Vasil. I think as a child, I was always attracted to the figure of the bad guy in the stories that I read. So I loved the witches and I loved the wizards. I was a very nervous child and very susceptible to any kind of tale of ghosts or the supernatural. And I remember my grandfather used to terrify me with stories of so-called real-life haunting that he was aware of, and these stories absolutely used to electrify me. And there was a kind of deep ambivalence. I was drawn to them, but they used to keep me awake and absolutely terrify me. So that's the kind of background, I think. But on a more academic side, when I was an honors student, which was my fourth year of study, I did a course on Victorian popular fiction. And really, Victorian popular fiction is an experience of the Gothic. So we did texts like Bram Stoker's Dracula. We did texts like Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde.
A favorite of mine, by the way.
Absolutely wonderful novel. We did texts like Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray.
Right.
We did texts like Trilby by du Maurier. So I was introduced to these Victorian popular texts, and the word Gothic was used in all of my seminars. And I quickly, developed this understanding mixed with my own kind of 1980s tango with goth subculture and bands like The Cure and the Sisters of Mercy, which I absolutely loved, and Susie and the Banshees. And I realized that my interest was absolutely piqued. So I wanted to learn where this material came from. And now one of the ways we think about Victorian culture and the Gothic, perhaps in ways that are old-fashioned now, but we think of late Victorian culture, the fin de siècle, as a kind of rebirth of the Gothic imagination that starts 100 years earlier and which comes back at the end of the 19th century during the fin de siècle, manifesting itself in texts like Dracula or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. I wanted to realize or explore where these texts came from. What was the tradition on which these texts were drawing? So I went off to the library, and in a sense, I've never come back. I started reading Horace Walpole. I started reading Anne Radcliffe. I started reading Matthew Gregări Lewis. I started reading William Beckford. These were very difficult reads at the beginning, and I think that's the first thing we have to acknowledge. They come from a very different frame of reference. They're not easily accessible to, a 20-something-year-old reader, and it became an acquired taste and something that I could not let go. And I really have never left that library, honestly, becoming more and more preoccupied with the cultural, literary, architectural, aesthetic, political origins of the Gothic imagination. So to get back to your initial question, I went the long way round in becoming interested in Gothic, starting off with so many texts that are still around today and at the origins of so many important subcultural and aesthetic concerns like vampires, horror film, vampire literature, always so important. Think of the countless filmic and televisual remakes of something like Bram Stoker's Dracula. And I wanted to explore the origins of these and went back to the 18th century, which is where it all begins.
So it's a crossover point between literature and history as well.
Oh, very much so. It's almost impossible to appreciate and to enjoy these novels, these dramas, the poetry that we call Gothic from the late 18th century without a very, very close consideration of the history that gave birth to it, the kind of culture and the context out of which these texts arose.
Right. Okay. So speaking of history, maybe we could talk about the history of the literary genre.
Yes,
of the Gothic
indeed.
Literature.
Indeed. Well,
when did it start? Yeah, how did it begin?
It begins really in 1764. The summer of 1764, when a very, very eccentric, wealthy young man called Horace Walpole writes a novel called The Castle of Otranto. And this novel is published on Christmas Eve, 1764. And the novel purports to be a translation of an Italian text that was found initially in the library of an ancient Catholic family in the north of England. So the text is published anonymously and it's passed off as a discovered, translated book, originally written in Italian, without an author. It's passed off initially as an antiquarian find. Now, antiquaries are those kind of gentleman scholars of the late 18th century that dabble in texts and the traces, material traces of the historical past. So this tale, The Castle of Otranto, is presented as a kind of discovery, a printed document, we're told, printed in the black letter. So there you've got the word Gothic, a kind of Germanic typeface, called The Castle of Otranto, presented as this kind of relic of the medieval past. And it is a text that teems with the supernatural. People mistake one another for ghosts. There are scenes of enchantment. There are moments of blood-curdling horror and terror, like the appearance of a skeleton in a hermit's cowl or a statue that starts to bleed from its nose. All of these references to absolutely extraordinary happenings happening in this text. Now, intriguingly, in the Castle of Otranto, the word Gothic is not used once. It would fall to Horus Walpole, the inventor or the kind of mind behind this extraordinary text that I've been talking about, to call that in the second edition of the Castle of Otranto that is published in 1765, for the first time, a Gothic story. So we have this extraordinary novel of the supernatural, of wonder, enchantment, of ghosts, of spectrality, of giants, of haunting in the first edition, being described in the second edition of a few months later as a Gothic story. Now, that word Gothic in that context means barbaric, uncivilized, non-classical, strangely also Shakespearean and natively English. And it becomes very clear that Horace Walpole is kind of licensing his use of the supernatural through Shakespeare. So Gothic there is meaning something natively English, different from neoclassicism, different from France, the French aesthetic tradition, different from the classical tradition. There you've got the word Gothic in all of those meanings coming together. Also the architectural. So when Walpole calls The Castle of Otranto purportedly this first Gothic novel, a Gothic story, all of those meanings that we've been speaking about swarm and attach themselves to the word Gothic. So that, on the one hand, is the origins of Gothic literature. Castle of Otranto, 1764, Christmas Eve, Horace Walpole, published anonymously as if it were this translation. All of that changes in the second edition, which he calls a Gothic story, and kind of comes out as the author. But as I've already suggested, Walpole is drawing upon impulses that he believes are already or were already in British culture before he started writing. So this is why Shakespeare becomes so important to the Gothic imagination. Shakespeare is being constructed as Britain's national bard at this time. And it doesn't take you too far to look at plays like Hamlet or plays like Macbeth or A Midsummer Night's Dream, the supernatural that we see operating in the Gothic imagination being traced back to earlier writers in the English canon, Shakespeare, John Milton, a whole range of dramatists from the early 17th century. And there we have too a number of dispersed origins of the Gothic, not only in Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto, but going back beyond Shakespeare, even into the kind of origins of English letters with Old English poetry, the monsters that we get in Beowulf, for example, or in medieval romance. So what I'm saying is that the origins of Gothic recede further and further away each time we try and locate them and pin them down. On the one hand, it's 1764, the Castle of Otranto. But if we explore that, it goes back to Shakespeare and Milton and their contemporaries and even further back.
And all this comes from the nice tying title, a Gothic novel, that suddenly turns some of the pre-existing literature into a precursor of the Gothic novel, right?
Precisely. That's a brilliant way of phrasing it. And, you know, I often say to my students when we discuss Gothic or when we introduce Gothic, thank goodness Horace Walpole chose that subtitle, A Gothic Story, for the second edition of The Castle of Otranto, because if he hadn't, I doubt very much whether we would have been here today.
Maybe so, but talking about something else.
Precisely.
A very English novel, for
example. Precisely. The very British novel, shall we say, yes.
A professor of very British literature.
Yes, indeed.
Doesn't sound so cool as Gothic literature. Like it's so...
Not at all.
All right, and then what happened? Because this is just the beginning of it. Suddenly, this turned into a literary, like, pandemic, but in a very positive sense. I mean,
a very, very
it
good
exploded,
word.
Right?
Very good word. Well, you see, Gothic almost has to, after this moment with Horace Walpole in the mid-1760s, Gothic almost goes underground for a period of about 13 years. And the next Gothic, self-consciously Gothic novel that we have is a wonderful but also very different text called The Champion of Virtue by Clara Reeve. It's published in the 1770s, so about 1777. The Champion of Virtue, in its second edition, it is called The Old English Baron. Now, what happens here is Clara Reeve has clearly read The Castle of Otranto, and she calls herself, her novel, the literary offspring of Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. So you've got a notion of filiation being put forward there. She's self-consciously and deliberately situating herself in Horace Walpole's tradition, and she says, I want to write a Gothic story.
Right.
A tale of other times. I want to use Gothic as a kind of adjective for historical, medieval, bit haunted, bit supernatural. But I also want to tame and domesticate and kind of civilize Horace Walpole's experiment, because she says his Gothic novel inspired laughter. Oh. And I want to inspire high sublimity and seriousness. So she adopts the Walpolean formula, but tries to kind of discipline it and write a much more conservative, less playful, less camp, less laughter-inducing Gothic novel. She believed that Horace Walpole's tendency or attempt at inspiring terror and pity and fear and horror was a bit of a disaster. So she tries to inspire high seriousness and sublime emotion in her novel, which we now generally read and refer to as the Old English Baron.
The
Very
Old
much
English Baron,
like
right.
Otranto, insofar as it's concerned with legitimacy, with domestic arrangements, with lineage, with inheritance, all of the things that Walpole is preoccupied with in Otranto, but in a much more serious, less playful mode. So that's the next kind of stepping stone. We then have a writer called Sophia Lee in the 1780s, writing a very influential historical novel called The Recess, which is, I suppose, the kind of third greatest hit in the early Gothic canon. And that is very much a historical novel. And this is what happens between the Castle of Otranto and the veritable explosion of Gothic fiction that we get post-1789, post the French Revolution. We have Gothic being taken up in historical romances, historical fiction. So The Recess is very much a historical novel about, two imaginary daughters of Mary, Queen of Scots. Of course, they never existed, but there's this kind of high imaginative quality that we associate with the early Gothic, and Gothic being very much a part of early historical fiction. But then, after that, the flood. 1789, the storming of the Bastille, major changes in France, major changes in Britain, major political upheaval really in throughout Europe. And this is when Gothic writing comes into its own, especially in the post-revolutionary decade in Britain of the 1790s, where by 1794, 1 in every 4 novels published is Gothic, i.e. either called a Gothic novel or a Gothic tale or set in Gothic times. So these are romances, and the term romance is important in this context. It means a kind of self-consciously, deliberately imaginative fiction. Very different from the novel, which is much more realist focused, realism based. These are romances, all detailing tales of ghosts, of goblins, of the supernatural, of often set in medieval pasts. And this is really the heyday of Gothic fiction, the 1790s. So that is really how it takes off.
Right. So I'm thinking, listening to you talk about Clara Reeve. I've never heard this name, but apparently she's actually the one responsible for establishing the tradition, because Horace Walpole's Gothic novel could have gone down in history unnoticed after that.
Indeed.
So her importance is actually very, very high.
Very, very high indeed. It's almost as if she needed to repeat with a difference Horace Walpole's formula in order to turn it into the kind of mode, or some people refer to it as a genre, that it has become. So fundamentally what you're getting at, Vasil, is that the Gothic is a mode or a genre that is dependent on notions of repetition for it to exist as such. Horace Walpole's formula needed to be picked up and repeated and slightly changed in order for it to reify into the lively mode that it would become, and indeed that it has remained to the present day. Very, very good point, that.
Right. And you also called it earlier a transmedia phenomenon?
Yes,
What do you mean by this?
Well, what I mean is that in the 1790s, although Gothic has one of its most significant cultural embodiments or manifestations in the romance form, i.e. in prose romances, in 3 or 4 volume prose narratives, it is a mode that very quickly infects, and let's get back to that very interesting metaphor that you spoke about, notions of kind of pandemic and infection. It infects so many other modes, forms, and genres. But let's talk about forms. So, Gothic three-volume romances are very quickly adapted into what we call chapbooks or blue books. Now, they're very, very long novels. Gothic romances are notoriously long. You know, The Mysteries of Udolpho is several hundred pages, one of the greatest novels of the 1790s by Anne Radcliffe, the kind of greatest Gothic novel in the so-called first wave, if you like. That is very, very quickly adapted into a chapbook. And there are several chapbooks, which are short, 72-page, usually illustrated versions of these much longer Gothic novels that really cut to the chase and take all the most horrid, terrifying, chilling aspects of Anne Radcliffe's fiction or Matthew Gregări Lewis's fictions or any of the major Gothic novelists' fictions and repackages them usually for working class readers who don't have the time or can't afford the longer novels. They don't have the time to take them out from circulating libraries, and they seek out these cheaper, much more readily available, cheaply printed, easily circulated chapbook forms.
Right.
So these are almost precursors to what we know as comics or graphic novels.
But sorry for interrupting you. They do manage to conserve this spirit of terror and wonder and everything else.
They really do. They amp up the suspense and amp up the volume. You know, a lot of these longer Gothic novels have pages and pages and pages of, say, descriptions of scenery and sublime landscape, all with that romantic impression or romantic aesthetic of the sublime and the beauty of the natural world.
Right.
Now, when you're dealing with a 72-page version of a much longer novel, you don't have the time or the space for all of that.
It's like 10% of the whole thing, right?
Precisely. So you cut to the chase.
Point, yeah.
You cut to the chase, you edit, and you only conserve the most lurid, bloodthirsty, chilling aspects of the novel, the most sensationalist parts of the novel. And they do really do a very good job of conserving just the most lurid details, coupling these with woodcuts and illustrations. And they do a very good job of that. But another way in which the Gothic becomes so much of a kind of transmedia phenomenon is that Gothic novels are also adapted for the stage. So you've got a very significant and important writer like Anne Radcliffe, the great enchantress, she's called, of 1790s culture, who never writes for the stage herself, but very soon you have dramatists of the 1790s adapting her extraordinarily successful 4- and 3-volume romances for the stage. So you can pay not at the legitimate theatres in London, Drury Lane or Covent Garden, but sometimes in the kind of fringe theatres, the kind of apocryphal theatres, the kind of illegitimate stage of the Romantic London, you can see a Radcliffe narrative on the stage. So that the Gothic drama becomes a kind of another avenue of transmedia transmission. You will get other Gothic writers like Matthew Gregări Lewis actively writing for the stage and putting on these splendid spectacles containing ghosts on the stage, staging ghosts. And this creates, much discussion in 1790s London. But also Gothic is transmedia insofar as it bleeds into, or to use your notion of pandemic, it infects poetry. And goes into poetry of the 1790s. Even the great romantic poets like Samuel Taylor Coleridge or William Wordsworth cannot quite prevent themselves from dabbling in the Gothic, even in their seminal 1798 collaborative endeavor, Lyrical Ballads, which is, in some readings of Romanticism at least, some readings of literary history, that very important collection of essays that galvanizes and starts Romanticism with a capital R. And you will see several Gothic moments in there, even though Wordsworth and Coleridge will do everything in their power to distance themselves from the kind of lurid thrills and tawdry sensationalism of the Gothic imagination. So Gothic is also a poetic medium. It will also infiltrate the craze for ballads and supernatural ballads and ballads of supernatural production and abduction that you see operating in late 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century culture. And last but not least, Gothic is taken up by the visual entertainments of the day, especially the phantasmagoric show, which is an early form of cinema, really, where people would enter into, for a small fee, a darkened room in something like Leicester Square in London, into a darkened room, a kind of hexagonal room, and they would see projected across the various surfaces of this room very, very lurid images or slides of images taken from some of the Gothic novels of the day. So one of the most significant and chilling and instantly recognizable iconic images from 1790s Gothic is the figure of the bleeding nun, a nun that hemorrhages blood, from Matthew Gregъри Lewis's novel, The Monk. Now, the bleeding nun, with her dagger poised and blood flowing out of her eyes and out of her habit, her nun's habit, is taken up as one of these iconic images in the phantasmagoric show. And she's projected onto these darkened screens, coupled with very rudimentary sound effects of thunder, of lightning. The skeleton in the monk's cowl that is kind of given to the Gothic with the Castle of Otranto, with Horace Walpole, is another one of these stock images that is projected onto the darkened screens of the magic lantern or the phantasmagoric show from the late 1790s, early 1800s. The phantasmagoric show is associated very much with popular entertainment in Paris, but it quickly crosses the channel like the terrors in post-revolutionary France. So I hope what I've been able to do there is give you some sort of indication of just how transmedia the Gothic is.
Absolutely. The thing that I'm imagining right now, speaking of transmedia, is William Blake.
Yes.
We can position him in this tradition, right? With both the paintings and the poetry.
We absolutely can. And there's been an interest in recent years of how even a visionary, metaphysically orientated poet and seer and bard-like figure and artist and engraver and etcher like William Blake is deeply, deeply invested in the Gothic imagination and deeply influenced by the Gothic imagination in so many respects.
Right, well, at least he's been translated to Bulgarian. Much more than the others you mentioned. We also have The Monk.
Yes.
Yes, but for example, Anne Radcliffe.
Right.
We just understood that just before the recording that there is only one translated book of Anne Radcliffe.
Apparently so.
Yeah, so in Bulgaria, she's not very known as a writer. She's like almost anonymous.
Yes, that doesn't surprise me because regrettably, I think that is very much the case even in English-speaking countries like Britain itself and in America. Anne Radcliffe is not the kind of household name that some of her contemporaries, like Lord Byron or Jane Austen, is. And if Anne Radcliffe is known, it's usually through someone like Jane Austen, who will parody and who will also pay homage to Radcliffe in a novel like Northanger Abbey. But there's a lot of work being undertaken at this very moment, particularly by friends and colleagues working on a project called Anne Radcliffe Then and Now, led by a good friend and colleague, Professor Angela Wright at the University of Sheffield, and involving a number of us who are working on a big scholarly edition of Anne Radcliffe's works, and also trying to recapture the kind of excitement that her name conjured up, recapture a sense of her importance to 1790s culture now, over 250 years later. So that is what we're trying to do. We're trying to reinvigorate the interest in and study of Anne Radcliffe, to try and turn her into something of the household name that she was in the Romantic period.
A very noble and interesting endeavor,
I
think.
It is indeed.
Yeah. Have you considered some ways to reach younger audiences with the project? I'm not imagining a TikTok on Radcliffe.
No,
but
don't
maybe,
laugh. Don't
maybe,
laugh.
I don't know.
Goth talk. Yes. No, well, one of the ways in is to look at a contemporary horror film like Crimson Peak, Guillermo del Toro. Now, that is in so many ways, and even, in as many words, del Toro's love letter to Anne Radcliffe. He has said in as many words that one of the great goddesses of that film, and indeed of his Gothic imagination in general, is Anne Radcliffe.
Right.
So one of the ways into that is to show the film, and this is what we're planning to do in the course of next year, and then get a critic to talk to teachers and, in the UK, to high school students, or what we call A-level students, to introduce them to Anne Radcliffe as the kind of origin of precisely what we see offered up in perhaps a more accessible and for them more legible version in Del Toro. So there are ways of kind of wooing younger audiences. And another way is by giving them pieces of her prose from some of her novels and getting students to respond creatively to them. It's also worth saying that her texts are increasingly likely to be taught on high school literary syllabuses. And what we plan to do in this project, the Anne Radcliffe Then and Now project, is to work with high school teachers, A-level teachers, and develop teaching material for them to take back to their students, to kind of spread the love, if you like.
Right. That was going to be my next question, because I myself am a school teacher. I teach philosophy, though, not literature.
Right.
So how is Gothic literature positioned in the current curriculum? Is there a place for Gothic literature?
Well, there absolutely is. And what happens, the curriculum changes every so many years, but some of the stalwart texts are texts that we can very easily frame as Gothic. And I'm thinking of some of the well-known texts like Northanger Abbey. That is a text that is often taught, Austen's Northanger Abbey, which is not only a parody of Gothic, but also a homage to Gothic.
Right.
But other texts like Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, another canonical Victorian Gothic fiction that is deeply invested in the Gothic imagination. Another canonical Victorian novel that is located and steeped in the Gothic is, of course, her sister's Wuthering Heights, another highly Gothic novel. There are also texts that seem to circulate and which have a very lively afterlife in things like graphic novels, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and a text that has become almost idiomatic when people refer to, he's a Jekyll and Hyde character. It's one of those texts that in many ways one doesn't have to read or have read in order to know what it's about. But I suppose the jewel in the crown for school children and high school children, and indeed younger children, is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and the preoccupation with monstrosity that text bequeaths or leaves to the Gothic imagination. And that has often been and is still taught on undergraduate syllabuses, on high school syllabuses, and is also available in so many sort of children's novels, versions for children, like Bram Stoker's Dracula, another one, and we think of Count Duckula and all of the Simpsons episodes with references to Dracula. So there are so many ways in which these Gothic novels have become appropriate for children.
Yeah, they are part of popular culture nowadays.
They really are.
And they are a fundamental part of popular culture.
Fundamental part.
And do teachers, if you know, of course, have a certain freedom to present some texts that are not in official syllabuses or curricula?
There is an element of choice, certainly on the A-level syllabus, and there has been A-level syllabus in the UK. There is choice within necessity, if you like, so kind of freedom within necessity. But what I think many teachers find is that Gothic always hooks young readers. Yeah. So it's a way of almost ensuring engagement and interest.
So school teachers are actually great partners for this project of yours.
Precisely. And we're looking forward to developing our work with school teachers in future years of this 3-year project.
I do wish you much luck with this.
Thank you.
It would be awesome.
Thank you.
All right. So we've been talking about the Gothic as something very characteristically British.
Yes.
But is the Gothic only British? Do we have Gothic literature only in Britain?
Yeah, no. Very, very, very good point. What happens is that the Gothic from the 1790s onwards becomes a transnational, in the same way that it's medial becomes transnational and international and nowadays global phenomenon. So what starts to happen is that Gothic is very, very quickly adopted by other cultures and translated. So you have in the 1790s all of the major British Gothic novelists translated into European languages, into French, into Italian, into Spanish. But lest we for 1 minute think that this is a one-way process of English texts being taken to Europe and America, we have to look at that and complicate that, because just as these British texts are translated into European languages, so they themselves are the products of translations from European languages. So Matyu Gregъри Lewis, the author of The Monk, translates and builds into his novel many German Gothic texts. And in fact, Gothic, the detractors of Gothic literature in Britain accuse it of being an imported genre. This is not ours, this is German. And the kind of taint of Germanism features or works its way into anti-Gothic critical discourse. So Gothic both is translated and itself translates and kind of cannibalizes other European literary forms. It crosses the Atlantic and it goes to the new American Republic with a writer like Charles Brockden Brown, later Edgar Allan Poe and Nathaniel Hawthorne, and the range of American Gothic writers that we love and read and enjoy so much today. Even someone like Herman Melville has moments of the Gothic. But what happens is that after this national Englishness, it becomes international with German, French literary traditions, it merges, and each of these different nations start to develop and in fact invent their own Gothic literary traditions that don't even think of or pay any attention to British traditions. So you think, for example, of the French tradition of the fantastique, or the roman noir, the dark novel. These are kind of native European modes, like in Germany, the Schauroman, the shudder novel, or the Rauberroman, the robber novel. These are all native, indigenous traditions of Gothic that develop throughout the later 18th and 19th centuries. Whether we can call them Gothic is quite a controversial question, because, in a sense, to call non-British forms of imaginative, ghostly, supernatural literature Gothic is perhaps to colonize those.
Right.
And this becomes more of an issue, I think, when we start to look at how Gothic from the early 20th century and into the 21st century is not national, is not international, but is a global phenomenon.
A global, right.
So we have this interest in global Gothic in our contemporary culture, which is really about the ways in which Gothic forms, conventions, techniques, concerns, preoccupations interact with, in a globalized world, modes of cultural expression that are not necessarily Gothic at their origins, but become Gothic when they give themselves up to the forces of globalization. So, for example, think of traditions of the supernatural in, say, Thai culture, just to take one example. Those are by no means Gothic, Thai beliefs in spirits, but the minute they become or give themselves over to the popular entertainment machine of modern and contemporary culture, like horror film, they become Gothic. So you've got a kind of hybrid form there of indigenous belief systems around the supernatural entering into mainstream entertainment in the form of a horror film, becoming global Gothic.
Could we call this Gothification?
Indeed we can. The Gothification of global culture. Very, very good verb there, yeah.
So listening to you, I also imagine that all this cross-cultural interchange in the narratives, in the themes, in the symbols that are used also adds a certain spirit of the uncanny, the unheimlich, which makes it even more supernatural.
Excellent point. Now, how does this work? Now, what happens, of course, is when we return to the origins of the Freudian uncanny and the unheimlich, it is that which is simultaneously familiar and strange. So both at once. And that is exactly the experience we have when we encounter in our globalized world a worn, familiar, perhaps even overly familiar Gothic convention or figure, like the vampire, but repurposed, reframed, repackaged in a new form, a new context to make it familiar, but also simultaneously unfamiliar. And in that moment, we experience that coupling of the familiar and the strange that is the Freudian unheimlich, the uncanny. So that moment of the uncanny, that coupling of the old familiar, I know this so well, it can't terrify me, coupled with the new, the slightly different, the element of surprise, the element of that which unsettles, we are in the realm of the uncanny. And that is one of the most fundamental Gothic affects or responses. Okay,
so I've got it right then.
You absolutely have.
From my limited experience of like an enjoyer of Gothic literature. Let's jump from literature to another interest of yours just for a second, because you mentioned in the beginning of our talk that they are interconnected when you were explaining the concept of the Gothic. And another key word that I've written here is architecture.
Yes.
I know for a fact that you also have some podcast experience, and some of it is called Revenants and Remains.
That's right.
I listened to an episode on my way here. Yeah. And it's about the ruins of Old Britain and the Gothic spirit. So how does this architectural strain connect with the literary?
Fantastic question. Now, I want to take you straight back to Horace Walpole, the Castle of Otranto's author. Right, so Horace Walpole, in addition to being the first Gothic novelist in one sense, is also a vital figure in what we call the Gothic revival in architecture. That means he is responsible for reviving the interest in and the aesthetic of medieval architecture, but quite anarchically and radically within mid-18th century English culture, where classical or subclassical Palladianism is the order of the day. Classical, regular, symmetrical architectural forms, that is the fashion, that is the orthodoxy. Horace Walpole, instead, swimming upstream, going against the grain, going against his own father's aesthetic tastes, Gothicizes, to use his own word, a very ordinary house in Twickenham, just outside London, called Chopped Straw Hall. A very ordinary house. He Gothicizes it, in other words, systematically turns it into a spectacle, a little Gothic castle of Gothic architecture, medieval architecture. So that is one of the connections between Gothic fiction and Gothic architecture. It happens with Horace Walpole, who writes his novel, The Castle of Otranto. Look at that signifier castle.
It's a castle.
Suggesting architecture, isn't it?
It is, yeah.
So for some critics, they believe that the Castle of Otranto, in which Walpole's Gothic story is set, is his own house, Strawberry Hill. He renames this Gothicized house, Chopped Straw Hill, as Strawberry Hill. And for some critics, they believe that the Castle of Otranto is a kind of fictionalized version of Horace Walpole's own house. And Walpole indeed exploits this connection. But one of the problems with that, of course, is that Strawberry Hill, this Gothicized house of Horace Walpole, is a modern construction. It's Gothic revival. It's not real stone. It's not a medieval ruin. It is built out of paper mache in the present. And Walpole has all sorts of anxieties about how his house is going to fall down and it won't outlive him. And it's just a paper house that is going to be dispersed and is going to blow away. That's because it's not a real medieval building. And the Castle of Otranto, this fictional castle in Walpole's novel, is what we believe to be, or what we're told to believe, an ancient medieval building. So what happens is that in Gothic fictions after Horace Walpole, they pick up on these architectural signifiers that are so important to Walpole, and they set themselves almost invariably in ancient medieval buildings, usually ruined. So the ruined abbey will become one of the most recognizable images or settings of an early Gothic fiction, a purportedly haunted ruined abbey. And this is where we get, I think, the Britishness of the Gothic coming through, because what is happening there? Well, a ruined abbey automatically brings to mind Henry VIII and the dissolution of the monasteries and the apparent vanquishing and eradication and annihilation of the Catholic past. Now, what happens in Gothic fiction is that Gothic fiction is perpetually fascinated by this remnant of the medieval past, by this superstitious Catholic past of ghosts and wonders and miracles and the supernatural, and therefore often sets itself in the ruins of medieval buildings as a way of historicizing itself. So Gothic buildings become historical markers of time as much as spatial constructs, and also as a way of calling up and evoking this vanished medieval past. It's kind of the remains, the ruins, the remnants and remains of the medieval past that so fascinates the Gothic. You see there, you've got that word Gothic, meaning barbaric, uncivilized, but also medieval. So the ruined architectural structure, in fact, becomes probably one of the most important characters in a Gothic fiction, if you like. So just think of the titles of some of the most well-known Gothic fictions from the 1790s. Anne Radcliffe's The Mysteries of Udolpho. Now, it's not immediately apparent from that title, but Udolpho is a castle. And it's a ruined castle. Anne Radcliffe will also have ruined abbeys in her Gothic fictions. And ruined architectural structures will be paramount. You know, one of the biggest signs that you are dealing with a recognizable genre in the late 18th century is that the novel you are reading has either abbey or castle, sometimes both, and often ruin in the title. So really what happens, as it did for Walpole 30 years before, Gothic architecture inspires the imagination of the Gothic writer and calls up images of the medieval past, of the savage, dark, barbaric Catholic past, a past that for these Gothic writers is seen as mysterious, is seen as Catholic, is seen as other, very different from the neoclassical tastes of the present, very different from the Protestantism of 18th century Whiggish British Protestant culture, very different from the reason, the rationality of the Enlightenment. Gothic is everything that the Enlightenment is not.
Right. Yeah. May I point out for our listeners, because I don't think this is something new for you, but for me as a reader, also from this part of the world and our tradition, the Bulgarian tradition, which is very, very different from the British tradition. It's on the other side of Europe. When I hear about a ruined abbey or a monastery, there is also another layer that's added there. It's the sacred and the profane that gather at the same place. So this is also very haunting, that there used to be a sacred place and now it is ruined. So evil forces lurk in this place where God used to shine his light upon.
Indeed.
And the castle, we usually see the castle as stronghold. So a ruined castle also means that some protection, some ward is now broken, and we are defenseless against the evil forces. Right?
Very, very, very good point. So this sacred and profane, I think, is crucial because as far as the British Gothic imagination of the 18th century sees it, these buildings have no right to call themselves sacred because the Gothic imagination is a fundamentally Protestant imagination. And they believe that the Protestant Reformation, that shift from Catholicism to Protestantism, was a kind of deliverance from the superstition, from the darkness, from the abuses of the Catholic past. So these ruined abbeys that exist as kind of historical scars on the landscape are reminders of this benighted, terrifying medieval past. but they are also signs of our deliverance, our fortunate deliverance from it, they believe. Whatever happens, they are haunted, but perhaps not by anything sacred, but by the vestiges of history, the remains of history, the kind of unfinished business of history, which for the Gothic writer is by no means sacred. It's more a kind of cultural trauma that these texts are dealing with.
Right, because they refer to the Middle Ages, which we also call the Dark Ages.
Precisely.
Right.
And Gothic is the art of darkness. It's about calling up the memory of this dark age of the past in order to drive the business of modernity. So Gothic imagines a dark, Catholic, benighted, savage, dark age past and sets its narratives in that past. That past often called up through an architectural signifier like a castle or an abbey always ruined. It calls up these images almost like an act of calling up a ghost, an act of necromancy, but only to drive the project of modernity. So modernity can construct itself against everything that the Gothic is.
Indeed. All right, so let's talk about the Gothic today.
Right.
Do you think that the Gothic is an evergreen? Because we've discussed that some vestiges of the Gothic, like the vampires and so on, continue sprawling new movies, books and so on, new settings in which we encounter them. What makes it so resilient that it stuck for so long?
Well, that's a wonderful question. And I think the point to be made is that the Gothic mode has proved to be as undead as the vampires and the zombies that stalk its pages. And I think that's what we need to bear in mind. Now, one of the ways in which we try and account for this is that Gothic always tends to emerge at times of cultural change and times of cultural emergency, times of cultural difficulty, times of cultural anxiety. Now, I don't think Gothic is always about the expression of cultural anxiety, because I think there is a fun-loving, joyous celebration of Gothic for its own sake that runs throughout and always has been there in Gothic. So Gothic is not always about the expression of cultural anxiety, but there is something about the Gothic that lends itself to treating things about which culture is a little anxious. So let's take our own day. Think of how our own experience over the past 5 years has been fundamentally changed by notions of pandemic. To get back to that early metaphor that you used for talking about the Gothic, think of how COVID fundamentally shifted our culture and I think culture globally, the West and the East and elsewhere. Now, couple that with our moments of climate emergency and what people are calling the Anthropocene, and this awareness of the ways in which human civilization has left an unbearable destructive footprint on the planet, on the earth, on its resources. Think of our cultural anxieties around climate change and the climate emergency, what we used to call global warming. Think about other major global concerns, the rise of fascism, neo-Nazism, the right-wing turn in global politics. All of these have generated a kind of overwhelming sense of cultural fear and terror and concern. Now, Gothic almost naturally lends itself, since it is, as one of, the Gothic's earliest 20th century, or one of the Gothic's most influential 20th century critics, David Punter, said, Gothic is the literature of terror. It is a form of writing that gives expression to terror and horror and devastation and loss and mourning. So much of our contemporary experience is framed by notions of terror. Think even of global terrorism and the threat of terrorism. The Gothic voices these global concerns. And this is one of the reasons why it is the mode that never dies and continuously comes back to step into places of cultural anxiety, to articulate, to amplify, to speak to represent so many of our current cultural anxieties.
Yeah, so the Gothic is a mode that is also a part of our life as a civilization, not only as individuals.
Indeed.
Right?
In the 1970s, the wonderful Gothic feminist writer and thinker Angela Carter said, we live in Gothic times. And that was in the 1970s. And I think we're still living in that, if not more, more so.
Well, to wrap up the conversation and to encourage future readers of the Gothic literature, what would you point out as some of the benefits of reading and researching also? Because we want to encourage people to also research Gothic literature.
I think the Gothic tells us so much about what we value as humans by holding up a mirror of the monstrous, of the abhuman, of the non-human, of the overly technical. The kind of nightmarish visions that we see in Gothic tell us about our dreams and everything we aspire to. I think the Gothic offers us a dark mirror in which we recognize and misrecognize ourselves. I think the Gothic concern with monstrosity stages everything that our culture finds abhorrent, and in our confrontation with our monsters, we can learn to be more ethical beings. I think we can learn to understand our history. I think the Gothic also shows us that which we cannot bear to look at. Gothic is very much about exposing that which is just too painful for so many of us to look at, about ourselves, about our culture, about our history, about our past. And I think there's something enormously freeing. I think there's something